World War II. Sirens sound the alert. German bombers will pound another British city tonight. During the Blitz, the two most important economists of the age shared air warden duty on the roof of King's College. An English gentleman and an Austrian exile, personal friends, but intellectual rivals. How their battle of ideas still shapes our life and society is our story. John Maynard Keynes helped the Allied governments defend freedom by planning their wartime economies. Fredrich von Hayek thought government interference in the economy was a threat to freedom.
The debate over market forces, whether you have an economy that's based upon prices or state planning, has been at the very heart of the economic battles of the last 100 years. For decades, the ideas of John Maynard Keynes dominated the economies of the Western world.
Keynes felt that the market economy would go to excesses, and when things were in difficulty, the market wouldn't work. Therefore, the government had to step in. Hayek felt that the market would eventually take care of itself.
It was only when Hayek was a very old man that his ideas began to prevail and the world began to change.
At the start of the 20th century, Hayek and Keynes had witnessed the first age of globalization. Every day, life was being transformed everywhere. Technologies like the telegraph and the telephone revolutionized communications. Steamships and railways made the world a smaller place. Tens of millions migrated without the need for passports. Keynes described this global market in which trade flowed freely.
The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea, the various products of the whole earth, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. Militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper. What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man was that age which came to an end in August 1914.
Hayek summed it up more succinctly.
We did not realize how fragile our civilization was.
The murder of an Austrian archduke by a terrorist triggered a world war. It would be almost 80 years before there was once again a truly global economy. World War I destroyed 20 million lives. It laid a whole continent to waste. There was blood and carnage amidst the beauty of the Italian Alps, where the armies of Austria and Italy were fighting. Fredrich von Hayek served in the Austrian artillery. He was only 17 years old, still a schoolboy. The fighting was ferocious. He experienced retreat and defeat.
The decisive influence was really World War I. It's bound to draw your attention to the problems of political organization.
He vowed to work for a better world.
The First World War was a cataclysm. People were disillusioned, people were bitter, they were looking for something better. Socialism, communism seemed to promise that better world.
Austria had lost the war and its empire. Vienna was a cold and hungry city. Revolution was in the air. Socialists and communists were winning the battle for hearts and minds. Young and idealistic, Fredrich von Hayek enrolled at the University of Vienna.
It was during the war that I more or less decided to do economics. I really got hooked.
Socialism seemed to promise a more just society. Albert Slabinger, a former pupil and disciple of Hayek.
He openly said that he, at one time, was a socialist of the mild sort, where concerns for the poor and concerns for fairness and equity would help to determine government policy.
Much of Vienna's intellectual life took place outside the university, in the coffee houses across the Ringstrasse. There were informal seminars for those who loved discussion and argument. Hayek joined the circle of a passionate libertarian called Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises believed markets, like people, needed to be free from government meddling.
Ludwig von Mises was the preeminent economist of the Austrian school. The distinguishing hallmark of the Austrian school of economic thought is that markets work and governments don't.
Von Mises predicted that the new Soviet socialist economy would never work, precisely because the government controlled wages and prices.
What von Mises said is that the great flaw of socialism is that it doesn't have a functioning price system to send all the signals to consumers and producers as to what something is worth. That these prices are at the very heart of what makes a functioning economy work. You can think of them as traffic signals. And if you don't have them, what you get is a system that doesn't work, or you get chaos.
Von Mises argued that free markets do it best. Why fool with anything else?
Germany and Austria were living with the economic consequences of the peace. Forced to pay unbearable war reparations, the defeated governments simply printed more money. The result? Inflation, more inflation, hyperinflation. It took a basket full of paper money to go shopping.
You saw people carrying their money on wheels because you had to pay for a piece of bread billions of Reichsmark.
Hayek, who was working at a statistical research institute, needed 200 pay raises in 8 months. Money was cheaper than wallpaper. Million-mark notes lit stoves. Shoes that cost 12 marks in 1913 sold for 32 trillion marks in 1923. In Hitler's favorite beer cellar, a glass of beer cost 1 billion marks. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of the middle class.
And that was one of the reasons for the success of the Nazis, of Hitler. They got support from these people who lost their fortunes.
Hayek would always see inflation as an evil that corroded society and undermined democracy. The fight against inflation became a cornerstone of his economic philosophy. Now teaching at the London School of Economics, Hayek feared that Keynes' Brave New World was a big step in the wrong direction. He attacked the growing consensus by writing The Road to Serfdom. Sarcastically dedicated to socialists of all parties, it was a popular success. There was even a cartoon version of it. Its message was simple and direct. Too much government planning means too much government power. And too much government power over the economy destroys freedom and makes men slaves. For Hayek, central planning was the first step to a totalitarian state.
Well, Hayek thought that since freedom was an absolute, you must let a competitive system just work itself out. And if at times that meant there was considerable unemployment, well, that's what you had to put up with.
Hayek always rejected macroeconomics. He rejected any government intervention during the Great Depression itself. Whereas Keynes was an activist, said in the long run we're all dead. And in the long run, if we allow things to go on without remedy, we get lots of Hitlers, lots of wars, lots of Stalins. Now, who was right?
Most people would have agreed with Keynes when he wrote this to Hayek.
What we want is not no planning or even less planning. We almost certainly want more.
In the battle of ideas, Hayek was on the losing side.
I had a fairly good reputation as an economic theorist in 1944 when I published The Road to Serfdom. And it was treated, even by the academic community, very largely as a malicious effort by a reactionary to destroy high ideals.
With the world at war, Keynes traveled to Bretton Woods and a grand resort hotel. Here, delegates gathered from all over the world to organize the post-war economy. The Bretton Woods Conference created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They were designed to bring stability to the world economy and prevent the unemployment and the depression of the 1930s. Keynes' idealism and humanity were an inspiration.
There has never been such a far-reaching proposal on so great a scale to provide employment in the present and increase productivity in the future. And I doubt if the world yet understands how big a thing we are bringing to birth.
Keynes did not have long to live. Ill and overworked, his health gave way, but his reputation and influence outlived him.
When Keynes died, Keynes and I were the best-known economists. Then two things happened. Keynes died and was raised to sainthood, and I discredited myself by publishing The Road to Serfdom. And that changed the situation completely. And for the following 30 years, it was only Keynes who counted, and I was gradually almost forgotten.
Hayek loved mountains. He said they breathed freedom. But he saw socialist ideals and the planned economy as threats to freedom. And so he organized a conference at a formerly fashionable hotel on the top of Mont Pelerin, Pilgrim Mountain.
Well, what happened in 1947 was that Hayek at last brought off a great dream, which was to assemble 36, mostly economists, some historians, a few journalists, a handful of what he regarded as survivors, good eggs, good intellectuals, who understood the market economy and the whole of the case.
This was Hayek's belief, and the belief of other people who joined him there, that freedom was in serious danger.
One of the delegates was a young economist from Chicago, Milton Friedman.
And the point of the meeting was very clear. Hayek and others felt that the world was turning toward planning, and that somehow we had to develop an intellectual current that would offset that movement.
They met downstairs in the cocktail bar. The room and its furniture are not much changed.
The whole world shadowed by the Iron Curtain, the Russian threat, by the failure to establish democracies in the Eastern European countries, and by the prevalence everywhere, intellectually, of these ideas of collectivism arising from the war. The argument always was that democracy is impossible without a free economy. You need a free economy. A free economy is a necessary, though not a sufficient condition for democracy.
The debates were passionate. At one point, Hayek's former mentor, Ludwig von Mises, stormed out of a meeting.
In the middle of a debate on the distribution of income, in which you had people whom you would hardly call socialist or egalitarian, people like myself, Mises got up and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and walked right out of the room.
But Hayek told the meeting that they had one great lesson to learn from the socialists.
Hayek paid enormous tribute to the socialist intellectuals and said that the great strength of the socialists is that they had the courage, he said, to be idealistic, to have a theory, to have a project, to have a vision, and to go on working towards that through thick and thin.
As the meeting came to an end, Hayek predicted a long fight, a battle of ideas that might last 20 years or more before the world changed its mind. In the meantime, Hayek could see only one gleam of light. By 1950, Hayek's market economics were so completely out of fashion that when he sought a full-time academic job in the United States, only one university was willing to hire him.
Chicago has always been an exceptional place, out of the mainstream. Chicago is geographically isolated. This affects Chicago's intellectual influence in many more areas than economics.
The University of Chicago's intellectual influence would grow. 8 professors and another 11 economists from Chicago went on to win Nobel Prizes. Gary Becker is one of them.
When I came as a graduate student to Chicago in 1951, I was flabbergasted by how stimulating the atmosphere was. I had been a very good student at Princeton. My first day in Friedman's class, he raised a question, I answered. He said, "That's no answer, that's just rephrasing the question." That was the example of how blunt people were.
Nobody was very polite. And people were interested in ideas and argument, and not in making sure you didn't ruffle anybody's feathers.
If you're sitting in a seminar room and somebody up there is saying something which, if imbibed by your students who are sitting in that same room, is going to lead them astray, it's up to you to call that guy right now, you see, and not later. And that, I think, is sort of the spirit that prevailed in the Chicago workshop system. There wasn't that much fighting in the lunches. They were pretty cordial.
Lunches at the Quadrangle Club were famous for the intensity of intellectual discussion. And one man came to dominate those debates.
Somehow Milton managed to set the agenda of argument. And so there was a saying, everybody loves to argue with Milton, particularly when he isn't there, because he's a good arguer.
Milton Friedman was becoming the most articulate spokesman for the so-called Chicago School of Economics.
The Chicago School meant was a strong belief in minimal government and an emphasis on free market as a way to control the economy.
You know, in many ways, Milton Friedman was a devil figure in my youth in a Keynesian household of economists because he seemed, with his emphasis on individualism, freedom, and markets, to be so unconcerned with fairness.
Liberals may have loathed the Chicago School, but Hayek felt on home ground in an intellectual atmosphere so like the Vienna of his youth.
Our vision is that the forces of the market are just that. They are forces. They are like the wind and the tides. If you want to try to ignore them, you ignore them at your peril. If you find a way of ordering your life which harnesses these forces to the benefit of your society, that's the way to go.
But in Washington, Keynes was still king of the hill. 19 years after he died, his face was on the cover of Time magazine.
Keynes's influence on economics at mid-century can't be exaggerated. The economic advice that economists gave to policymakers said, the only reason you have bad economic outcomes is because the government's not doing enough. It sounds almost like central planning, doesn't it?
Washington's Keynesians saw the economy not as a force of nature, but a sophisticated machine to be fine-tuned by technocrats like themselves. The Keynesian consensus was summed up when that most Ivy League of presidents, John Kennedy, received an honorary degree from Yale.
It might be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree.
For JFK, Keynes had won the argument. The battle of ideas was over.
What is at stake in our economic decisions today is not some grand warfare of rival ideologies which will sweep the country with passion, but the practical management of a modern economy. What we need is not labels and cliches, but more basic discussion of the sophisticated and technical questions involved in keeping a great economic machinery moving ahead.
Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisers had drafted his speech along Keynesian lines.
We thought it was a great day when Kennedy decided to give that speech at Yale and to talk about economic policy. That speech suggested that we had won over Kennedy. We had won the heart and mind of the president.
For what came to be known as the 30 glorious years, Keynesian economics had been delivering the goods. Europe, Japan, and America all saw high economic growth and rising standards of living. People enjoyed a prosperity undreamed of at the end of the war. When Hayek moved back to his native Austria, he was depressed. The success of mixed economies made his free market theories, and Hayek himself, seem more irrelevant than ever.
The world was very much a socialist world. His ideas were not fashionable. Nobody seemed to listen to him. Nobody seemed to agree with him. He was alone.
Hayek found his ideas shunned by the academic world.
Well, most of the departments became dislike me, so much so that I can feel it to the present day, that economists very largely tend to treat me as an outsider.
He was living in a provincial town and stuck in a rut. But the outside world was beginning to change. Skimming the newspaper in his usual restaurant, Hayek read how inflation and unemployment were rising at the same time. There was a new word to describe it: stagflation. After 30 glorious years of growth, the American economy was in trouble.
The economy basically was kind of going nowhere and had inflation, which didn't seem to get cured, and kind of a malaise in the economy.
Stagflation was the end of naive Keynesianism. You had two things at the same time, which under the Keynesian view would have been impossible. You had stagnation in the economy, a high level of unemployment. You had inflation with prices rising rapidly.
President Nixon looked like a Chicago economist's dream come true. Milton Friedman was a special advisor, and George Shultz was in charge of the budget.
About the wholesale price index a moment ago. One of the big areas where prices were going up at wholesale very rapidly was lumber and other materials associated with home building.
But the president wasn't listening. He tried to spend his way out of trouble.
Going to wind up having its impact on the cost.
To add insult to injury, he declared, "Now I'm a Keynesian."
This declaration by Nixon horrified his conservative supporters. Indeed, one congressman wrote him, said, "Mr. President, I'm going to have to burn all of my old speeches." And Nixon wrote back to him, "I will too."
Nixon decided he hadn't gone far enough. So he took his top economic advisors off to Camp David for a working weekend. Ben Stein, the quiz show host, was a junior speechwriter in the White House, and his father was at the meeting.
Here's my father walking into the president's cabin to meet Mr. Nixon, and there's George Shultz right behind him. I'm not sure, but I think it's a fair bet that at any one of these meetings, they're complaining about something being wrong. Probably talking about prices and stagflation. I'm not sure.
Dick Cheney was a young aide at the time.
I always remember a debate we had during the Nixon administration when the public was convinced that food prices were going up. So the political debate was whether or not we should impose a freeze on food prices.
The supposedly conservative Republican Nixon opted for wage and price controls.
Nixon was a great one for doing something, I think.
Margaret Thatcher had a gut instinct for market economics. Her father had been a grocer, and when she was a girl, she had helped him in the shop. Hard-working and studious, she won a place at Oxford University, where she became interested in student politics. While she was at Oxford, she read Hayek's Road to Serfdom. It made a lasting impression on her. Years later, when she became the first woman to lead the Conservative Party, she once slammed Hayek's book down on a table and announced, "This is what we believe."
Thatcher's office came on and said, could she come and drop in to see him? And so she called by, and there was a period of unaccustomed silence from Margaret Thatcher as she sat there, intense, attending to the master's words.
By 1974, Hayek sensed the world beginning to go his way.
And so far as the movement of intellectual opinion is concerned, it is now, for the first time in my life, moving in the right direction.
In the battle of ideas, 1974 was a turning point. Hayek's Nobel Prize came as a surprise, but the balance was now shifting away from Keynes and towards Hayek.
I'd like to say that when I was a young man, only the very old men still believed in a free market system. When I was in my middle ages, almost I myself and nobody else believed in it. And now I have the pleasure of having lived long enough to see that the young people believe again in it. Now that is a very important change.
With the economy in apparently terminal decline, the people voted for a new conservative government, headed by Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister on the day of my father's birthday. So he sent her this telegram from Freiburg. "Thank you for the best present to my 80th birthday that anyone could have given me." And a few days later, she wrote back from 10 Downing Street. "Dear Professor Hayek, I'm very proud to have learnt so much from you over the past few years. I am determined that we should succeed. If we do so, your contribution to our ultimate victory will have been immense. Yours sincerely, Margaret Thatcher."
And I'll strive unceasingly to try to fulfill the trust and confidence that the British people have placed in me and the things in which I believe.
Determined, and some said strident, she would revolutionize the economy.
The spirit of enterprise had been sat upon for years by socialism, by too high tax, by too high regulation, by too high public expenditure. The philosophy was nationalization, centralization, control, regulation. Now, this had to end.
Carter's rival was the Republican Ronald Reagan. Reagan shared the same economic philosophy as Margaret Thatcher. For over 20 years, he had been campaigning against the Keynesian orthodoxy and for Hayek and Friedman's ideas of free markets and freedom.
Reagan knew Hayek personally, and he knew Milton Friedman personally. And Reagan was, in a sense, their popularizer. So he was the person who could take these people who were very profound but not very easy to communicate. I mean, I don't think you'd ever get Hayek on the Today Show. But you could get Reagan explaining the core of Hayek with better examples in a more understandable language.
What Margaret Thatcher did in Britain and the principles that she introduced were imitated worldwide. Asia, Latin America, even in Africa, and to some degree in the Middle East.
The tide had surely swung. The thinkers that had kept alive the ideas of markets did play their role at that moment.
In his lifetime, Hayek saw fascism rise and fall, communism come and go, and the end of his years in the intellectual wilderness.
Here was a man who had intellectually changed the world without ever really leaving the university. It was the power of his books, the power of his ideas, as then captured by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, that had changed things.
You had in Reagan and Thatcher at the same time two what I call idea politicians. They had ideas, they were convinced they were the right ideas, and they put them into effect.
The coincidence of Thatcher and Reagan having been in office at the same time was enormously important for the public acceptance worldwide of a different approach to economic and monetary policy.
The old debates were about what the role of the market was, what was the role of the state. I think it's now generally appreciated that it's the market that harnesses people's initiative best. And the real focus in progressive thinking now is not how to oppose and suppress market forces, but how to use market forces to achieve progressive objectives.
If you look at the whole of the 20th century, there's been a huge cycle. Less government was the orthodoxy at the beginning of the 20th century. More government clearly was the orthodoxy for the middle part of the 20th century. And now the later part, going into the new millennium, we're back to where we were practically at the start of the century. And you have to give folks like Hayek and Friedman, and then later Reagan and Thatcher, their due for pushing all of this along.